It all began with the soft knock of a suitcase wheel against polished marble. Ava had never stepped into a place like this before. The mansion rose above her like a kingdom frozen in time, wrapped in silence and shadows. Every servant seemed to move with fear, stitched into their steps except for her, and when Alexander Westbrook laid eyes on her for the very first time, something shifted. The man who ruled through silence paused. But what came next was something no one within those walls could have ever imagined. If this story moved you in any way, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. The gates opened with a mechanical groan, revealing a long cobblestone path framed by ancient oaks and trimmed hedges that seemed too perfectly shaped to be real. The late afternoon sun cast golden stripes across the gravel, flickering through the leaves like memories refusing to stay buried. Ava clutched the handle of her suitcase, the wheels catching slightly on the uneven stone. Her breath fogged slightly in the crisp autumn air, carrying the faint scent of wet earth, cedar, and distant chimney smoke. She paused at the base of the stairs leading to the grand entrance, her heart thudding, like it wasn't quite sure if this was the right place to be. This wasn't just a job, it was an escape, a fresh start, but nothing about the towering Westbrook estate felt welcoming. The door opened before she could knock. A woman in her 60s, stern but not unkind, greeted her with a nod. "You must be Ava." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Miriam, house manager. Follow me." The floors inside were so polished they reflected the chandeliers above like silent witnesses. The house was massive but quiet. Too quiet. Every step echoed. As they passed through hallways lined with oil paintings and antique mirrors, Ava noticed how every surface gleamed, but nothing felt alive. The warmth of the season outside hadn't crossed the threshold. "Mr. Westbrook values discretion and discipline," Miriam said over her shoulder. "You'll speak when spoken to, never enter the East Wing, never ask personal questions. Understood?" Ava nodded, holding her gaze steady. "Understood." There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Miriam studied her as if searching for something deeper. "You don't scare easily, do you?" "No," Ava answered softly. "I've been through worse than silence." She was shown to a small but elegant room on the second floor, overlooking the garden maze. As she unpacked, she noticed how the wardrobe doors groaned and the mattress felt untouched. No one had lived in this space for a long time. Downstairs, Alexander Westbrook stood by the library window, watching her reflection in the glass. Not her form, but her energy. He hadn't meant to come home that early, but something had drawn him back. He had everything, wealth beyond reason, power that could bend deals and silence enemies. But peace, love, he had long dismissed those as fantasies sold to the weak. Still, there was something unsettling about the young woman who had just arrived. She had looked him in the eye when she entered the house. No fear, no curiosity either, just a kind of presence. It annoyed him. It intrigued him. Later that evening, Ava began her work in the West Wing, dusting shelves, organizing ledgers, tending to things most guests would never see. She moved efficiently without drawing attention, yet her calmness somehow echoed louder than any noise. By the time the sun had sunk into the horizon, casting the estate in shades of cold blue and amber, Alexander stepped out of his office. His footsteps were deliberate. The staff always knew to vanish when he walked past. Not Ava. She was kneeling by the window in the drawing room, fixing a latch that had come loose. The scent of worn leather, aged books, and something faintly floral, maybe her perfume, lingered in the air. He stopped. "You're not scheduled to be here this late," he said. She turned, slowly rising to her feet. The window wouldn't close properly. It could let in rain overnight. He looked at her, really looked. No flirtation, no fear, no servitude in her eyes. "You're not like the others," he murmured. Ava tilted her head slightly. "I didn't come here to be like anyone else." The silence between them stretched, brittle and charged. His jaw tensed. She didn't flinch. He left without another word. That night in her room, Ava lay awake. The wind rustled through the trees outside, a soft howling that reminded her of nights in the orphanage when she used to pretend the wind was her mother's voice, whispering lullabies through the darkness. This place was nothing like home. But strangely, it didn't frighten her. There was pain here, not hers, but someone else's. Buried deep in the walls, in the silence, in the cold stare of the man upstairs. She could feel it. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Meanwhile, Alexander poured himself a glass of scotch in his study, the fire crackling low beside him. His phone lit up with messages, business deals waiting to be approved, invitations to events he'd never attend. He ignored them all. Instead, he thought of her, the girl with calloused hands and quiet eyes, the girl who looked at him like he was just a man, not a billionaire, not a shadow, just a man. And somehow that was more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. At breakfast the next morning, the staff murmured in the kitchen about how the new girl hadn't flinched when Mr. Westbrook walked in, about how he'd stopped, spoken, looked at her. "She won't last," someone said. "No one does." "She's different," Miriam whispered, "and that might be the problem." Ava, however, wasn't concerned with rumors. She focused on her work, maintaining dignity in everything she did. But every now and then, she could feel his gaze, watching, studying, not in lust, not in judgment, in confusion, as if she were a language he'd never learned, but longed to understand. 3 days passed. Their paths didn't cross again, until the night the storm rolled in. The power flickered, thunder cracked, the wind howled louder than before, and as Ava passed by the grand staircase with a candle in her hand, she heard the sound of a piano, one she hadn't seen anyone touch. She followed the music. There in the library, Alexander sat alone, his fingers grazing the keys in a slow, haunting melody. He stopped when he saw her. "I didn't know anyone played," she said. He looked at her, a ghost of something human in his expression. "Not often." She didn't move closer. She just stood there, candlelight flickering between them. "Some things sound better when no one's listening," he added. Ava held his gaze. "Then why are you playing while I'm here?" He had no answer. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, he spoke again, barely above a whisper. "What are you really running from, Ava?" She paused. Then, without looking back, she said, "Maybe the same thing you are." And just like that, the room fell back into silence. But the walls had heard something they'd never heard before. Honesty. And neither of them would sleep well that night. The headlines often called him a genius. Westbrook acquires 5th tech firm in 12 months. The billionaire who doesn't blink. The man behind the empire of silence. But no article, no camera lens, no gala appearance captured the truth about Alexander Westbrook, because no one dared look closely enough. The world admired his success, feared his silence, envied his reach, and yet not a single soul truly knew him. He had grown accustomed to the sound of nothing, the quiet hum of servers in his home office, the echo of his footsteps on marble floors, the way people paused their breath when he entered a room. Power had taught him how to command attention with just the tilt of a gaze. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to raise his voice. People bent, not out of respect, but out of survival. He preferred it that way. Detachment had become his armor. No expectations, no disappointments, just control. His mornings were precise. Gym at 5, calls with global partners by 7, breakfast alone, always alone, a protein shake, no sugar, no distractions. His life was a grid of control, discipline, and curated solitude. He trusted no one except numbers. They didn't lie, they didn't betray, they didn't leave. Women, they were part of the design, strategic, beautiful, fleeting. They came and went like storms, passionate, wild, and ultimately forgettable. He never let them stay the night, never let them get past the gates of the East Wing. That part of the house, like the deeper parts of himself, was off limits. He didn't believe in love. That word was a myth sold to fools by poets and broken mothers. He believed in leverage, in silence, in winning. But then Ava walked into his house like she didn't care who he was, and suddenly something broke form. It was in the way she moved, without fear, without seduction, without expectation. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and that made her impossible to ignore. She didn't wear designer perfume. Just something faintly floral, almost nostalgic, the kind of scent that lingered in old gardens and childhood memories. He found himself seeking it in the hallways without understanding why. He watched her once from the shadows as she helped the gardener with his gloves. Her hands weren't soft like the others. They bore the quiet strength of someone who had worked, fallen and risen again. It irritated him. She made no effort to impress, yet somehow she disarmed him more than any woman ever had. He hated that, and he needed to understand why. Late one night, he called Miriam to his study. "Who is she?" "Ava, the new housemaid." "I know her name. I asked who she is." Miriam hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a strange protectiveness. "She's quiet, disciplined, keeps to herself, no record of complaints, no scandals, lost her mother young, raised herself, doesn't ask for anything, doesn't expect anything either." Alexander sipped his drink slowly. The fire reflected in his eyes like a slow burn. "She's hiding something," he muttered. Miriam raised an eyebrow. "Aren't we all?" He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his private lounge, watching old CCTV footage of Ava, not in obsession, but in analysis. He didn't understand this disturbance she created in him. Every woman before had been predictable. Ava was a paradox. She was present without performing, strong without aggression, beautiful without trying, and it shook him. For a man like Alexander Westbrook, losing control, even slightly, was dangerous. The next morning, his meetings were shorter, sharper, his tone more cutting. His team felt it, investors heard it, but only Miriam knew what was behind it. She saw the way his eyes wandered to the hallway where Ava had just passed, saw how his fingers tapped the desk a little too fast after she entered a room. And she remembered a younger Alexander, the one before the empire, before the betrayal, before the silence became a shield. But that boy was gone now, wasn't he? Years ago, when his father died, Alexander didn't shed a single tear. The world assumed he was heartless, but grief had no place in a man who was trained to conquer. His father had been cruel, charming in public, monstrous in private, and Alexander learned early that love was a weapon people used when they couldn't win with money. He swore he'd never need anyone. He built walls, not the kind you see, but the kind you feel. Walls made of expectation, perfection, and coldness so sharp it could slice through any emotion that dared approach. Until now. Until Ava. One afternoon, Alexander stood alone in the East Wing, a room preserved like a time capsule. Dust floated in the sunbeams, dancing slowly, undisturbed. This was the wing no one entered, not since the day he'd locked it all behind him. The room belonged to his mother. She had died quietly, not in body but in spirit, years before she ever left this world. He remembered her brushing his hair, humming lullabies through tears she thought he couldn't see. A woman who loved deeply, and was broken for it. He had decided then, never love. Love made you weak, vulnerable, disposable. But now Ava's presence was unearthing something raw inside him, and he didn't know if he could suppress it much longer. That evening, he saw her again, in the dining hall arranging silverware with meticulous care. Her hands moved with purpose, her expression calm. He stood at the entrance, arms crossed. "You're different," he said abruptly. She looked up. Their eyes met. "So are you," she replied without hesitation. He stepped closer, each footfall deliberate. "Why don't you fear me like the others?" She paused. Then, "Because power doesn't impress me, and silence doesn't scare me." His lips twitched, almost into a smirk. "You think you understand me?" "No," she said softly, "but I see through you." He didn't answer. He simply turned and left. But inside, something cracked open. That night, Alexander walked barefoot through the corridor outside her room. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood there in the dark, listening to the stillness. What was this? A trap? A weakness? Or something human? He placed a hand against the cold wood of her door. He didn't understand the urge, but for a moment he allowed it. Then silently he walked away, disappearing once again into the shadows that had always protected him. Ava, on the other side of the door, remained still. She had heard his footsteps, felt them, but she said nothing, because some doors are only meant to open when both hearts are ready. Desire for Alexander had always been immediate, sharp, fleeting, and entirely within his control. Until now. There was something about Ava that burned slow. It wasn't her body, though it was undeniably beautiful in a quiet, unpolished way. It was the way she didn't try to be seen, and still she was all he could see. The way her silence wasn't submission, but restraint. The way she walked like she belonged to herself, not to anyone else. And that alone was intoxicating. He began to notice everything. The soft hum she made when concentrating, the way she tied her hair when she was working, how her fingers brushed the spines of books in the library, not skimming, but listening to them, the little laugh that escaped her when she thought no one was around. Alexander didn't want her, but he did, not in the way he had wanted before. He didn't want to have her, he wanted to understand her, and that scared him more than anything. He tried to distract himself. More meetings, more training, more wine. He even invited an old flame to dinner. Someone flawless, curated, predictable, but she spoke with too much polish. Her laughter echoed too loudly against the empty walls, and when she touched his arm, all he could think about was how Ava hadn't. How Ava had never tried to get close, and yet felt closer than anyone had ever been. He ended the evening early, his mind consumed. Ava felt it too. She noticed how the air shifted when he entered a room, how his voice, deep and steady, softened only when addressing her, how his eyes lingered not in hunger, but in confusion, maybe even longing. But she didn't allow herself to imagine more. She had seen what powerful men could do with affection. How they could turn it into a leash, how they could twist it into control. Still, there was something different in his silence. Not the silence of dominance, but of someone quietly unraveling. One evening, after most of the staff had gone to sleep, Ava walked through the garden under a blanket of stars. The sky was ink black, and the cold nipped gently at her skin. She came here to breathe, to be alone with her thoughts. Then she heard it. Footsteps. She turned, and there he was. Alexander, unshaven. Without a jacket, no pretense, just him. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quietly. "You didn't," he replied. His voice was lower than usual, almost hesitant. She studied him. In the moonlight, he looked younger, tired, human. "I come here when I can't sleep," she admitted. "Then maybe I've come to the right place," he murmured. They stood in silence, surrounded by the rustling of trees and the faint scent of lavender from the garden beds. He looked at her, not like a man who wanted to conquer, but like someone who had never seen light until now, and couldn't look away. A few nights later, it happened again. Not a meeting, but a collision. In the hallway near the library, she was carrying a stack of books when she bumped into him. He reached out instinctively, steadying her waist with his hands. They froze, not because of the touch itself, but because of what it awakened. His hand lingered longer than it should have. Hers didn't pull away. Their eyes met, not as master and employee, but as man and woman. "I'm sorry," she said, breath-catching. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, deeply, painfully, like he was memorizing her face for the moment she would inevitably disappear. And in that gaze she saw everything he couldn't say. "I don't know how to want you without breaking you. I don't know how to stay away. But I'm terrified of getting close." From that day on, the tension became unbearable. Every accidental brush of fingers, every glance held a second too long, every unspoken word felt like a spark in a room soaked in gasoline. He tried to keep distance, but he couldn't stay away. One afternoon he watched her through the glass doors of the ballroom as she helped Miriam arrange the flowers for a charity event. She wore a simple dress, modest, neutral, but in that light she looked ethereal. He felt something twist inside him, a hunger that wasn't carnal, but spiritual. He wanted to know her pain. He wanted to hear her story. He wanted to give her something he didn't even know he had left. Later that night he found her in the kitchen alone, preparing tea. The others had gone. "Do you always work this late?" he asked, his voice quiet. She turned, her eyes tired but warm. "Some things are easier to do when it's quiet." He stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "There's something about you," he said, almost to himself. She tilted her head. "Something good or something dangerous?" "Both." She smiled. "A real one, for the first time." "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." He looked down, almost embarrassed. "I don't know how to be around you," he admitted. "You confuse me." She didn't move, didn't respond. And then, softly, "Maybe you're not supposed to be around me. Maybe you're supposed to see yourself in me, and that's what scares you." Those words hit deeper than any truth he had ever heard. That night, he dreamed of her. Not naked, not moaning, not wanting, but laughing. Just laughing. A sound so unfamiliar, it startled him awake. He sat up in bed, chest heaving, sweat on his forehead. Not because of arousal, but because of something worse, yearning, and it was killing him. Days passed, and though neither of them said it aloud, the gravity between them only grew. He'd find excuses to be near her. She'd pretend not to notice. He stopped attending events. She stopped asking why. They existed like two stars circling the same sun, pulled together, terrified of the collision. Until one evening, it almost happened. A storm rolled over the estate. Thunder cracked in the distance. The mansion was dark, lit only by the fireplace in the drawing room where Ava had taken shelter with a book. He walked in. Neither said a word. She sat on the couch, the glow of firelight dancing on her skin. He stood by the mantel, pouring himself a drink. Lightning lit the sky outside. Inside, the air was heavier than ever. She closed the book slowly, looked at him, and without thinking asked, "Why do you always look like you're somewhere else?" He turned. That question pierced something. "I spent most of my life trying to escape places I could never leave." She nodded, understanding. And then silence, long, full, magnetic. He crossed the room slowly, sat beside her. Close. Too close. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved. He looked at her lips, then her eyes. She didn't back away, but just before the inevitable kiss, he stopped, breathed in, shook his head. "I can't." Ava looked down. "Then don't." And with that she stood and walked away. Not with rejection, but with grace, leaving him alone, breathless, and full of a desire that no longer belonged to the body, but to the soul. It was a cold, breathless afternoon, the kind where the light outside was silver rather than gold. The wind curled like smoke against the windows of the Westbrook estate, brushing against the ancient glass as though trying to slip through, unnoticed. Inside, the mansion was quieter than usual. Most of the staff had gone into town. A brief power issue had delayed a scheduled event, and Alexander had sent everyone home early, everyone except Ava. She remained, as always, focused and composed. There were ledgers to update, shelves to be catalogued, a quiet place to think or to stop thinking at all. So she found herself in the library. The door creaked gently behind her as she stepped in, inhaling the familiar mix of leather-bound books, cedarwood polish, and the faintest trace of old tobacco. Not smoke, just the ghost of it. It was warm inside, but not because of the fireplace. That hadn't been lit in years. No, the warmth came from the space itself, from time that had settled into the pages, from stories that had waited decades to be opened again. She moved through the aisles with reverence. Her fingers brushed the spines, reading titles in silence. Then she heard the door close behind her. She turned. He stood there, Alexander, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. "I didn't expect anyone to be here," she said, steady but soft. He took a few steps forward. "Neither did I." Something about his voice was different today. Less distant, still low and controlled, but hesitant. She glanced at the window. The storm outside was building. Thunder rumbled long and low like a warning. "Do you come here often?" he asked. "Only when I need silence that feels alive," she replied. He nodded, slowly. "I know what you mean." There was a beat of silence, a pause that neither of them tried to fill. Then Alexander walked to one of the shelves, the oldest one, and ran his hand along the row of books. "This library belonged to my mother," he said, voice almost a whisper. Ava turned slightly, watching him. "She used to read to me here. Before—" He didn't finish. Before what? Before the silence took her? Before he learned to build walls out of wealth and vengeance? Ava didn't ask. Some wounds bleed more when named. He pulled a book from the shelf, a weathered collection of poems. The edges were frayed, the spine cracked. He held it out to her. She used to read this one when it rained. Ava took it gently, brushing her thumb over the faded title. Letters to a Silent God. She opened it, letting the pages fall naturally, landing somewhere in the middle. Without thinking, she began to read aloud. "We do not seek fire to burn, but to remind us we are not made of ice." Her voice was calm, but thick with meaning. Alexander didn't move. "I've never heard anyone read like that," he said after a moment. "Like what?" she asked, closing the book. "Like you believe every word, even the ones that hurt." She met his gaze. "Maybe I do." And in that instant, something passed between them, something raw and unspoken, a shift, a breach in the dam. He took a step closer, not with dominance, with vulnerability. "Why don't you have fear in you?" he asked suddenly, not demanding, but almost desperate. "I do," she said. "I've just learned not to obey it." He exhaled, eyes searching hers. "You should be afraid of me." "I'm not," she said simply. His brow furrowed. "You don't know what I've done." Ava stepped forward slowly. "No, but I know what you haven't done." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "You haven't hurt me. You haven't tried to use me. You haven't hidden behind your name with me, even if you try." He looked away. That truth was heavier than any accusation. Thunder cracked again. The room trembled slightly, and then he said it. Something he never said. "I don't know who I am anymore." Ava didn't flinch. She stepped even closer. "You do. You've just spent years trying not to be him." The moment hung in the air. Her eyes held his, not as challenge but as invitation, to feel, to surrender, to speak the truth for the first time in years. Then, without warning but without urgency, he reached out, just his hand, just a gesture, and gently he touched her wrist, not in lust, not in control, in need, human, trembling, terrified need. She didn't pull away. Their eyes never left each other. And in that quiet library, with the rain beginning to fall outside, like the tapping of memory on glass, everything changed. His thumb grazed the inside of her wrist. Ava could feel his pulse, fast, uncertain, alive. He looked at her as though seeing color for the first time. "I don't know what this is," he whispered. She answered without blinking. "Then don't name it, just feel it." He let go. But the connection didn't break. It settled in the air between them, a fragile, sacred thing. Something too pure to be spoken, too dangerous to be ignored. He stepped back. The fire was in his eyes now, not anger, not desire, recognition. Not of her, of himself, reflected in someone who didn't flinch, someone who didn't want anything from him but the truth. As Ava turned to leave, he called out, softly, "Ava." She paused, hand on the door. He didn't say anything else, just her name. And the way he said it made her heart tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Because in that one word, she heard all the things he wasn't ready to say, yet. Outside, the rain fell heavier now, and inside the library, the air still carried the warmth of something new being born. Not passion, not control, but connection. And maybe, just maybe, the first crack in a man who had spent his entire life behind glass walls. The days that followed the moment in the library felt heavier, like walking through rooms filled with smoke, where every movement stirred something unseen. They spoke less, but felt more. They weren't avoiding each other. They were orbiting, watching, waiting, and every glance now felt like a secret. Ava found herself breathing differently around him, more slowly. Not out of fear, but to quiet the noise inside her chest, that subtle but constant trembling that whispered, "He sees you." She was used to men noticing her body, but Alexander noticed her. The silences, the hesitations, the defiance, the fragility she kept hidden. And that terrified her far more than any touch. Because it was the first time someone looked at her and didn't want to change, possess, or control her. He simply wanted to understand. For Alexander, it was worse. Worse because he couldn't escape her, not physically and not mentally. He had tried more than once to push her from his thoughts. He buried himself in meetings, deadlines, distractions, but she was always there. In the scent of lavender she left behind, in the stillness of the halls after she passed, in the echo of her voice reading that poem. And worst of all, she made him feel. One late afternoon, a fire was lit in the drawing room, not by staff, but by Ava. She had found the room cold and unwelcoming, and something inside her had urged her to change that. Not for him, not for anyone, just for herself. She sat on the floor, her back against the velvet sofa, legs stretched out toward the warmth, a book in her lap, a cup of tea beside her. It was a moment of peace, until he walked in. He paused in the doorway. The light from the fire danced across her face. Her hair was loose, softer than usual. She didn't startle when she saw him, didn't rise, didn't hide. "Didn't know anyone still used this room," he said quietly. "Maybe it was just waiting for someone to bring it back to life," she replied. A silence followed, heavy, tender. He moved closer, slowly. She closed the book. "I can leave." "No." His voice stopped her, gentle but sure. "Stay." He sat beside her, not on the sofa, on the floor. Like her, the space between them was only inches now, and neither moved. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth and shadows. "You're not what I expected," he said after a long pause. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, but not someone who makes me feel like—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Like what?" He swallowed. "Like I'm not in control." Ava smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. He turned toward her fully. His gaze searched her face like it was a map he'd never had the courage to read. She didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't run, and in that shared stillness, something inside both of them surrendered. Not to desire, but to truth. His hand moved, slow, uncertain, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head gently into his touch. That was all it took. A beat of silence, a flicker of vulnerability, and then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, wasn't devouring. It wasn't the kiss of a man used to taking. It was hesitant, almost reverent. His lips met hers like a question, not an answer. Ava responded, not with passion, but with presence. She wasn't surrendering. She was meeting him, exactly halfway. Their kiss deepened, just slightly, as if their hearts were trying to speak through touch. Two lives filled with scars and silence, finally finding a common language. When they pulled apart, they didn't speak. They just stayed there, forehead to forehead, breathing softly, slowly. Ava placed a hand on his chest, not to hold him close, but to feel the heartbeat she had always suspected was still there beneath the armor. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she whispered, eyes still closed, "If this is a game, don't kiss me like that." His breath hitched. "It's not." "Good," she said, "because I don't survive games. I survive truth." He pulled back slightly, eyes wide. And for the first time since they met, she saw it. Fear, not of her, but of losing what he didn't yet understand, yet already knew mattered. "I don't want to break you," he murmured. She looked up. "You won't," she said. "But you won't fix me either." He nodded slowly. "I don't want to fix you, I just—" His voice faltered. "Don't want to go back to the way things were before you." Ava rose to her feet gently. He looked up at her. She offered him a hand. "Then don't," she said. He took it. She helped him up. And for a moment, they stood there, close, still unsure, but honest. No masks, no roles, just two people who had tasted something rare and terrifying. Real connection. Before she left the room, she turned one last time. "If you ever use this against me," she said softly, "I'll walk away. No second chances." He nodded once. "I wouldn't blame you." She smiled, not out of joy, but out of relief. Because for once, a man had kissed her not to claim her, but to meet her. That night, neither of them slept, not out of tension, not out of guilt, but because something had awakened that neither could silence now. A longing that lived beyond the body. And as dawn approached, they both looked out their windows, hearts beating differently, not faster, but freer. Ava embraced him with everything she had. This time they reconnected deeply, no longer just with their bodies, but with their souls. Alexander chose differently now. He chose her. He chose life. Some love stories begin with a kiss. Theirs began with a choice. The return to the mansion wasn't triumphant. No flowers, no applause, no grand promises. Just two weary souls, with eyes tired from crying, with bodies worn from waiting, but with hearts finally free. Ava walked in with steady steps. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had arrived with a small suitcase and a guarded heart. She was a woman who knew who she was. And now, she knew who he was, too. Alexander walked beside her in silence until they reached the library, the very place where it had all begun. Now, without tension, without urgency, only truth between them. He turned to her. "There's something I need to say, something I've never told anyone." She nodded, waiting. "I don't want to be who I was anymore." The words fell softly, like breath over fading embers. She smiled, faintly, not because he promised to change, but because he finally understood why he needed to. That night, Ava slept in her own room, he in his, not out of fear, but out of respect. They were learning to walk the same path again, this time side by side. In the days that followed, Alexander did the unthinkable. He turned off his phone, cancelled meetings, gathered his board of directors, and announced his departure. "It's time I live a life I've never known," he said, facing the executives who revered him. "A life with space, with soul, a life that doesn't suffocate me just so I can look strong." Some called it madness, others a crisis. But Ava simply watched, calm, silent, because she knew that true change doesn't need guidance. It needs to be felt. He sold properties he had never visited, delegated the empire, tore up contracts that no longer mattered, and for the first time in years, he breathed. Ava returned to her routines, but lighter now. She still cared for the house, still preferred wildflowers to expensive jewels, still read in silence, her soft smile hidden in the corner of her lips. She hadn't changed for him. She had remained herself, and that was why he loved her more every day. They cooked together, walked the corridors slowly, laughed at small things, argued when needed, cried when memories resurfaced, but they never withdrew into silence again. Now, they chose to stay. One morning, Alexander made coffee for both of them, clumsy, spilling a little, but with a genuine smile. From the table, Ava looked at him and said, "You don't look like the man I once met." And he answered, "That's because, for the first time, I am who I was meant to be." They traveled, not to luxurious destinations, but to places where no one knew his name, where he could hold her hand without stares, without shields. They slept in small inns, woke to the smell of fresh bread and morning coffee, and looked at each other as if to say, "Finally." Ava kept writing, now about flowers, about time, about what happens when a person is truly seen. Alexander began painting, badly, but happily. "When I paint," he said, "I don't command, I just feel." She replied, "That's why it's so beautiful." One day he took her to the hill behind the mansion, a place he had never shared with anyone. There he planted a magnolia sapling with his own hands. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. "Because it will bloom slowly, like me, like us." She knelt beside him, her hands sinking into the soil. And together they stayed there in silence, because there was no rush anymore. Their love was no longer an explosion. It was a shelter, built on small choices, on mutual forgiveness, on a truth that had survived everything. He still carried shadows, she still bore scars, but now they had enough light to never lose each other again. In the library where it had all begun, Alexander hung a new frame, a single page from the book she had read on that stormy night. "We do not seek fire to burn, but to remind us we are not made of ice." Ava read it and whispered, "Neither are you." They didn't celebrate anniversaries, not because they forgot, but because what they had wasn't measured by dates. It was measured by quiet mornings, by the smell of bread in the oven, by the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to be understood. Years had passed since the day doubt tried to destroy them, and contrary to what many believed, they hadn't vanished from the world. They had simply chosen their own world, smaller, simpler, truer. Alexander, now far from the stages of power, walked differently, still steady, but no longer to impose. Now he walked like a man carrying something precious within, and knowing he had nothing left to prove to anyone. And Ava? She was exactly as she had always been, serene, present, attentive to the details no one else noticed. She didn't become a fairy tale wife. She wasn't shaped by promises or luxury. She remained Ava. And that was what saved Alexander. Their wounds didn't disappear, but they became part of the house, like cracks in an old wall, visible yet not ugly. Marks of those who had lived, who had fallen, who had chosen to continue. They never spoke of destiny, because destiny alone couldn't explain what had survived between them. It couldn't explain a love that endured silence, power, abandonment, lies, trauma, and still stood tall. The garden bloomed more with each season, but the plant Ava cared for most was the magnolia they had planted together. It grew slowly, like all things that are true. One morning it opened its first flower. White. Simple, steady. Alexander touched the petals as though touching his own story, and said, "It didn't bloom despite the winter. It bloomed because of it." Ava smiled. Like us. They still had bad days, moments of silence, fears that returned like distant echoes. But now, when that happened, they knew what to do. They sat, looked at each other, and stayed. They didn't run, because the love they had built was wide enough to hold the pain. One day, while arranging an old drawer, Ava found Alexander's letter, the one he had sent with the test results, the one where he confessed, "I'm still fighting, for the truth, for us." She read it again, like revisiting a photograph of a war they had already survived, and she placed it inside the book she had read that first night in the library. Between pages marked by pain, she left the letter of redemption, because there lay the full circle, the beginning, the conflict, the doubt, and the final choice to stay. Sometimes they still lay beneath the night sky like they once did. And Alexander would ask, "Would you still have chosen me if you had known everything from the start?" And Ava would answer, "I didn't choose you despite who you were. I chose you because I saw who you could become." They had learned that true love isn't the one that arrives perfect. It's the one that survives the imperfect. It's the one that grows even among ruins. It's the one built every single day with small gestures and great courage. And so, without spectacle, without magic, without a grand ending, they continued. Not because destiny willed it, but because they did. And they had enough courage to love not with promises, but with presence.